Hi everyone, today we'll be taking a look at the technique of palm muting. In a lot of my videos and song tutorials, I mentioned something like, oh, be sure to put a palm mute on that riff or on those few notes, and I don't really have the time or space to elaborate, and a couple of questions have come in, those of you wanting me to go further into palm muting, so let's cover what I hope is going to be every question that you have related to palm muting. I'll cover palm muting, how it relates to rhythm guitar as well as lead, because it's not just a rhythm technique. Once you get proficient with it, you'll be using it all the time. And we'll also talk about palm muting, how it relates to all downstrokes versus alternate picking. There is a slight difference in technique that I use that works for me, so I'll show that to you. And lastly, I'll show you how to put some dynamics behind your palm muting, because that's a thing that a lot of people miss, is how to get really in control of your guitar while using a palm mute and creating some dynamic range with that. So I'll give you a little exercise to get you going that'll get you thinking about that as well. So let's define palm muting. Palm muting is exactly what the name implies. It's using the palm of the hand to slightly mute the strings to achieve a sound that we couldn't get otherwise. So what we're using more specifically is this part of the palm, and we're just going to place that down on the strings close to the saddles, right back at the bridge, and we get this chunky yet clean and articulate sound, right? So let's bring you in close and really look at this. Okay, so the first thing that we really want to find is where is that sweet spot that we're going to place our hand. So you want to place your hand right back where the string crosses the saddle, so on the bridge of the guitar, and you're going to lightly place your hand there and find this chuggy sound. Okay, let's compare that with the sound of an open string. So if you don't put any palm mute on, let's take this low E string and just apply downstrokes to it with no palm mute. Sounds like this. Okay, now let's put that palm mute back on. Sounds like this. So you can hear how that palm mute really cleans the sound up and makes it punchy. Okay, so here's a couple of tips for finding that sweet spot. First of all, if you put your hand down and the string's completely dead, right, that means you have your hand too far up towards the neck of the guitar, and you just have to bring it back towards the bridge to find the sweet spot. The reverse is if you're just hearing an open string with no mute, then you're too far back behind the saddles. You need to slide your hand back up towards the neck until you find that desired amount of mute. Okay? So one nice easy trick is to purposely start a little too high up towards the neck and gradually bring your hand back until you find that desired amount of mute. You can hear it start to get chuggy, right? Okay, now you can play with the degree of palm mute too, how heavy or how light the palm mute is, and that can be done in a couple of ways. You can push a little bit harder to get a heavier palm mute and gradually release the pressure until your hand's right off the strings. Right? Be aware though that especially on a floating trem system like what I've got, there is a limit to how hard you can push. You'll send the strings out of tune. They'll go sharp on you. But another way is to slide your hand back towards the bridge until it's off the string completely. And you can hear how that went from heavy palm mute to no palm mute at all. Okay, so now let's take a look at one more thing, the difference between straight down strokes and alternate picking. Because when I'm doing all down strokes with a palm mute, I find that my thumb is fairly straight and that pick is quite parallel to the string, so it's moving in a very down-up motion. However, when I apply some alternate picking, I put a little bend in the thumb that twists the pick so that it's now going through the string more on an angle. And when you're alternate picking, you want that angle because that will let the pick glide through the string nice and easy without getting snagged. If you tried to alternate pick straight up and down, that pick is going to get caught. It'd be very hard to do. It'll just snag and catch. So that's why you want that little twist so that it glides through the string nice and easy. Now let's do a couple of quick playing examples so that you guys can see this technique in action. We'll do a down picking example as well as an example that uses some alternate picking so that you can see the slight difference in technique that I use. So let's start with Metallica's Creeping Death. This uses exclusive downstrokes, so pay attention to my straighter thumb, and that, puts less rotation on the pick so that it's going much more down up. And it goes like this. Okay, now let's compare that with a playing example that uses some down-up picking. We'll use Metallica's Battery. That's got some nice gallops in it. And I need to put a little rotation on the pick so that that pick doesn't get tripped up on the strings. So I put a little rotation. That means bending my thumb ever so slightly so that I'm now attacking the strings at more of an angle than when I'm strict down picking. And I can do that, right, while still applying a palm mute. Okay, so Metallica's Battery goes like this. Okay, hopefully by now you're feeling very comfortable knowing where to place your picking hand to achieve that optimum palm mute, as well as thinking about those slight differences in technique between straight down picks versus something with an upstroke in it as well. Now, let's talk about developing control of your palm mute. And you should definitely go out and develop your own exercises as well as find songs that you're interested in, anything you think is going to be fun and help you develop this technique. But at this point, with my students, I help them to develop their palm muting technique by playing rhythms where we take the palm mute off throughout the measure at strategic places, okay? So let's just start with a very basic rhythm, straight eighth notes, chugging on an E power chord. Okay, and we want to get this rhythm 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Okay, it's just 8 down picks per measure. Each down pick is half a beat each. All right, so that's why there's 8 of them. Now, once you have that rhythm going and you can feel it, let's start taking that palm mute off in a couple of strategic places. First of all, we'll take it off on the downbeat of beat 2. So it'll be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So when we say 2, we take our hand off the strings, really get those strings to pop, accent them, and that's going to help you really develop control of using that palm mute, taking it right off, back on, finding that sweet spot, and this will be second nature in no time. Okay, so let's play that a couple of times. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Right, and you can slow that down. You know, don't get this in your head at the exact same tempo. You should be able to play this at all tempos, so slow it down. Right, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and so on. Let's make it a little bit tougher with one more example. We're going to keep that off on 2, but take it off on the end of 3 as well. So we're going to have an upbeat to feel. So it makes it a little bit more challenging. You're going to develop your sense of rhythm and control of the palm mute at the same time. Here we go. It's going to go like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Okay. So work with those examples. That's really going to help you develop your sense of timing, like I mentioned, as well as your palm muting. And then from there, you can play all these different riffs, you know, like the creeping death, that you really have to have control of that palm mute to be taking it on and off throughout that measure. Right? And even things like Iron Maiden use that technique a lot. 2 Minutes to Midnight. Right, you'll use that technique all over the place. And now to start developing your palm mute with down up picking, just pick a riff that uses some 16th notes. That's usually pretty good. You know, you can create your own exercise, but one riff that I really recommend that's pretty simple is Ozzy Osbourne's I Don't Know. Not a lot going on in that riff, but some power chord stabs and a lot of chugging 16th notes on the open A string. Okay, so the riff goes like this. Okay, so that's a nice, easy riff to really start working on. And like I said, you don't have to get intimidated if these things seem too fast for you. Like I tell all my students, you can play anything if you play it slow enough, right? We can slow that down. right? So on. You get the point. I don't need to play through that whole thing slower, but just slow it down and really, analyze that rhythm so that you're developing the technique and your rhythm at the same time. Okay, so now we've covered really how the palm muting relates to a lot of different rhythmic situations. Let's also discuss how it relates to lead playing. So when it comes to lead work, we have to palm mute on the high strings, which can prove to be a problem. And a lot of my students, they're doing their chuggy work down here on the low strings. And then they do a lead lick and they have to palm mute and they rotate their wrist and they try to get a palm mute going on the high strings, but that doesn't work very well. You're just changing your technique too much, right? You're putting the pick at such a weird angle now, not to mention your wrist. So don't forget that when you're doing lead work, you still want to slightly be moving your hand up and down the strings to maintain your technique as much as possible, right? Once you've dialed in a technique that works for you, you don't want to be changing it overly if you don't have to. The more you can keep that wrist and arm consistent with what you're used to, the easier it's going to be for you, right? But remember, you still want to be using that same part of your hand to palm mute the strings. So you may have to put a little twist on that wrist as you go up, but try to minimize that. Okay, so let's just try to get a palm mute on each string. Let's start on the high E string. Right? And you can notice how far up now my hand went up the string. I didn't stay down here, right? I slid it up a little bit so that I don't have to really rotate my wrist to get that palm mute. And it goes for all these, like the B and the G string. I'll slide down now slightly just to keep that technique the same. If I'm picking on the B string, G string, right? And away you go. So let's talk about a couple of little lead licks that we can do to develop this palm muting so that it becomes second nature during your lead breaks as well. So just a couple of quick examples that will help you develop palm muting during your leads. Let's take this Randy Rhoads inspired example. Right? Slowing this down. Similar to a pattern that he did in that live Suicide Solution solo that he did. So yeah, doing that pattern will help you really feel that palm mute on those middle two strings, the G and the D. And that's just straight 16ths, right? So you're just going to be doing constant down, up, down, up. Now let's do a different pattern on the high strings because I'm also going to show you how to start applying some dynamics with this pattern. So it's a slightly more involved pattern, but let's slide it up to 7, 8, and 10 on the E and the B strings. Okay, so the pattern goes like this. Right, so we're going up those strings, down, and back up. And that's the pattern. Another straight measure of 16th notes. Putting a palm mute on the whole time. Okay, so you got to find that nice sweet spot. Use a technique that doesn't seem, very awkward. It shouldn't be hurting. So just dial in that palm mute first. Get that. Okay, get that nice palm mute going. You can get that pretty quick. It's a nice little shred sequence. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about as we close this video out is how to develop some dynamics, because really you want to get so that you're expressing yourself. That's why we're using any technique. It expresses yourself, right? You don't have to play these licks with a palm mute. You don't have to put any palm mute in your lead licks at all. But why would you choose to do that? You're expressing yourself. That's what you're hearing in your head, right? So to get this so that you're really expressing yourself, that becomes second nature, work on getting some dynamics so that you have real control over this technique. So let's try crescendoing our playing now. We'll start with a nice light feel, nice soft touch. Crescendo it louder, more aggressive, and then dial it back down to a light touch, really increasing the dynamic range of our playing and really dialing in the control of the palm mute. Okay, so it's going to go like this. Okay, so nice and soft, try to barely even hear it. Get louder, get softer again. Now, one tip that I will give you though is that my picking does naturally get a little bit harder, but mostly I'm achieving dynamics through the use of the pick. The more pick that's making contact with the string, the more mass that has to go through the string, the more aggressive it's going to be. So I'm ever so slightly pushing the pick into the strings when I want to crescendo louder, and then I'm ever so slightly lifting the pick out of the strings when I want to dial it back and get a little bit softer. So start playing with those dynamics in your playing, and you're really going to have a lot of control over your lead playing and just playing in general. So I think that about does it, guys. We've talked about palm muting with all your rhythm aspects as well as the lead aspects, exercises, and ideas to develop both. So if there's any more questions that I might have missed, hopefully not, but if there is, drop them in the comments and I'll answer them in an upcoming video. But if not, then I'll see you next time.